We had been hiking all day. The trail was beautiful, cutting through a dense forest that seemed untouched by time. By dusk, we found a small clearing by the edge of a river. It was perfect, serene, peaceful, like something out of a painting. My friends, Tom and Sarah, were setting up the tents, while I gathered firewood. As I wandered into the woods, the light dimming, I couldn't shake this feeling. It wasn't fear exactly, but an odd sensation, like I wasn't alone. I shrugged it off. We were deep in the wilderness, after all. The creaking trees and rustling leaves were just nature doing its thing. I returned to camp just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting everything in shadows. The fire cracked and popped as we sat around it, telling stories and laughing, trying to ignore the cold night air pressing in on us. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He shook his head. "Hear what?" That unease crept back in, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was the wind, or an animal in the distance. Then, it happened again. This time, closer. A whisper, but not in the wind, it was coming from the woods behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just trees. My breath came quicker, and the warmth of the fire didn't feel so comforting anymore. "Guys, seriously, did you hear that?" I asked again, more urgently. Sarah frowned. "You're freaking me out." "What are you talking about?" Another whisper. This time, it was unmistakable. It was a voice. Low, garbled, like it was right behind me. I felt something cold brush the back of my neck. I shot to my feet, spinning around, but the trees were still, as if mocking me with their silence. "I'm telling you," I said, "something's out there." Tom chuckled nervously, but I could tell by the look on his face that he wasn't as calm as he pretended to be. Sarah gripped her flashlight tighter. We sat there for what felt like hours, listening, the fire now casting eerie shadows. And then we heard it, footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving just beyond the tree line. "Maybe it's an animal," Sarah whispered, but her voice cracked. "No animal moves like that," I thought. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and our ragged breathing. Then, out of the darkness, a low, guttural laugh. It wasn't human. We scrambled to our feet, panic setting in. The fire flickered wildly as if reacting to some unseen force, and that's when I saw them, eyes. Glowing, staring at us from the trees. Dozens of them. "I think we should leave." "Now," Tom whispered, but his voice trembled. Before I could respond, a figure stepped out of the darkness. Pale, gaunt, with eyes too wide and too bright. Its face was twisted in an unnatural grin, as if its skin was pulled too tight across its skull. It whispered again, and this time we all heard it. "Come closer." I don't know who screamed first, but we bolted. Running through the woods, tripping over roots and branches, my lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead. Behind us, that whisper followed, growing louder, more insistent. "Come back, come closer." We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Panting, covered in scratches, we slammed the doors shut. The whispers had stopped, but that feeling, that cold, pressing presence, lingered. As we sped down the road, away from the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I swore I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me from the treeline. I've never been back to those woods, and I never will. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my brother Jake, and a couple of our friends, Mark and Lisa. We hadn't gone camping in years, and the idea of unplugging from the world sounded perfect. The remote spot we found was deep in the mountains, away from the noise, away from people. Just us and the wilderness. The first night was fine. We laughed, ate marshmallows, and told stupid ghost stories around the campfire. The sky was crystal clear, the stars so bright they felt almost close enough to touch. After a while, Jake and Lisa went to bed, leaving me and Mark to keep the fire going. Mark was always the joker, but that night, he seemed off. His eyes kept darting into the darkness around us, like he was looking for something. "What's up?" I asked. He shrugged. "Dunno, man. Just thought I saw someone out there." I froze for a second, trying to see what he was looking at. "You're joking, right?" Mark gave a nervous laugh. "Yeah, probably just shadows or something. Never mind." I tried to shake off the unease, but from that point on, I couldn't relax. The forest felt wrong. Too quiet. Every crack of a branch made my skin crawl. Eventually, Mark went to bed, leaving me alone by the fire. I didn't feel tired yet, so I stayed up, watching the flames dance. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from behind me. I turned, expecting to see Jake or Mark sneaking up on me. But there was no one. Just the dark outline of trees swaying gently in the breeze. I stood up, scanning the tree line. "Jake? Mark?" I called out, my voice sounding shaky even to me. Nothing. Just the wind. My heart was pounding now. I stared into the woods for what felt like forever, every shadow looking like it was about to move, every rustle of leaves sounding like something, or someone, creeping closer. But there was nothing. Trying to calm myself down, I threw more wood on the fire, the sparks shooting up into the night sky. I kept my eyes fixed on the trees, though, just in case. That's when I saw it. Just for a second. A figure. Standing far back in the woods, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, lanky, and watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I convinced myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was tired, maybe it was just the shadows playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, the fire crackling as I stared into the woods, waiting. Listening. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of movement. My eyes snapped open, and the fire had nearly burned out, casting everything in dim, orange light. I strained to hear. The footsteps were back, but this time, they were faster. Closer. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it into the trees, my hands shaking. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest floor, but there was no one there. No movement. Just trees. And then I heard it, a voice. A low, gravelly whisper from somewhere just out of sight. Watching. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, the flashlight shaking in my hands, and that's when I saw it again. The figure. But this time, it was closer. Much closer. Its pale face barely visible through the trees. Its eyes locked onto mine, wide and empty. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The figure raised a hand and pointed directly at me. Watching. I bolted toward the tent, tripping over rocks and logs in my panic. I burst inside, shaking Jake awake. "Dude, there's someone out there." I gasped. Jake rubbed his eyes, confused. "What are you talking about? It's the middle of the night. I swear to God, I saw something." Someone. Mark and Lisa stirred, groaning as they woke up. We need to leave, I insisted, my voice frantic. But Jake wasn't convinced. It's probably nothing. Just your imagination. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed up, sitting by the tent entrance, listening. But the footsteps and whispers were gone, and the figure didn't come back. At first light, we packed up and left. The whole drive back, I kept glancing out the car window, half expecting to see that figure standing by the road, watching us leave. It wasn't until we got home that Jake asked, "What exactly did you see last night?" I hesitated. "I don't know, man. Just, something wrong." He didn't say anything for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Weird. Because I thought I heard someone walking around our tent, too." Neither of us talked about it again, but I still dream about those woods. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can hear footsteps outside my window. It was the kind of camping trip that felt like a fresh start. My girlfriend Emily and I had been through a rough patch, and we thought a weekend in the quiet solitude of the mountains would help us reconnect. Just the two of us, no distractions, no cell service, just nature. We set up camp in a small valley, surrounded by towering trees. By the time we got the fire going, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting everything in a cool, dark blue. Emily was sitting by the fire, and I wandered to the edge of the campsite to stretch my legs. That's when I saw it. A light. Faint, but distinct. It flickered just beyond the tree line, about 50 yards away. "Hey, Em, check this out," I called, pointing toward the woods. She stood up and squinted into the distance. "Is that a lantern? Maybe there's another campsite nearby." "Could be," I said, but something about it seemed odd. The light wasn't steady like a flashlight or a campfire. It was dim, swaying back and forth, like someone was carrying an old, oil lantern. We didn't think much of it at first. After all, we weren't the only people who camped in these woods. But as we ate dinner by the fire, I kept noticing it, that soft, eerie glow bobbing between the trees. Hours passed. The night deepened, the forest becoming a shadowy maze under the stars. And that light? It was still there. It hadn't moved any closer, but it hadn't left either. "Okay, that's weird," Emily said finally, hugging her knees to her chest. "Why is it just sitting there?" "I don't know," I admitted, staring into the woods. "Maybe someone got lost and set up camp over there." "Should we check it out?" she asked, clearly uncomfortable. Something in my gut told me not to. "No, let's just stay here. If someone needs help, they'll come over." We tried to go back to our conversation, but the light became impossible to ignore. It wasn't going away, and now it seemed closer. A subtle shift, but it was definitely moving, slowly, through the trees toward us. Emily stood up, now visibly nervous. "What if it's not a camper?" What if it's someone else? I grabbed the flashlight and shone it in the direction of the light. "Hey!" I shouted. "Anyone there?" No response. I scanned the area, but all I could see were the outlines of trees and shadows shifting in the beam of my flashlight. The light was still there, bobbing slightly, but it wasn't coming from a person or a tent. It was just floating. "Okay, that's creepy," I muttered. The lantern-like glow stopped moving. It was now maybe 30 feet away, just beyond a thicket of bushes. I felt my heart start to race. "Emily, I think we should get into the tent." She nodded, her face pale. We grabbed our bags and rushed into the tent, zipping it up behind us. Inside, we sat in silence, listening to the wind rustle the trees outside. For a moment, I thought maybe we were overreacting. Then, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching over the dry leaves outside our tent. Emily's eyes widened, and she grabbed my arm. "What the hell is that?" I didn't answer. My heart was pounding in my chest. The footsteps circled around our tent, slow and steady. Whoever, or whatever, it wasn't in a hurry. They were taking their time. The footsteps stopped directly behind us. We held our breath, straining to hear. And then, a sound I'll never forget, a soft tapping on the fabric of the tent, like someone was drumming their fingers against it. Tap. 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 I swallowed hard. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No answer. Just that soft tapping, and then the sound of the footsteps again, walking around the tent, always just out of view. Suddenly, the tent lit up. A dim, flickering glow washed over us, casting eerie shadows inside. The light, that strange lantern, was right outside. It hovered there, impossibly close, but there was no shape, no person holding it. Emily squeezed my arm so tightly it hurt. "What do we do?" I shook my head. I didn't know. I didn't even want to unzip the tent and look. But then the light started to fade, drifting away slowly, back toward the trees. The footsteps followed it. We sat frozen, listening as the light moved farther into the woods. The glow vanished, swallowed by the darkness, and the footsteps finally stopped. Neither of us spoke for a long time, too afraid to break the silence. When we finally unzipped the tent and peeked outside, the woods were pitch black, and the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed up, huddled together, jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle of wind. By morning, the forest felt almost normal again, but we didn't stay long. We packed up quickly and hiked out of there without looking back. To this day, I still don't know what we saw. But every once in a while, I'll think back to that night, to that strange, flickering light, and wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting for someone else to follow its glow. It was supposed to be a reunion, a trip to relive our high school camping days. Just me, Ethan, Ryan, and Jake, out in the woods, the way we used to do it back when life was simple. We chose an isolated spot near a lake, far from any hiking trails or campsites, the kind of place where you could disappear from the world for a few days. The first night was perfect. We set up the tents, fished by the lake, and told stories by the campfire, laughing about the old days. But as the fire burned down to embers and the night deepened, something in the air shifted. It started when Ryan wandered off to pee. He didn't go far, but when he came back, he was pale, like he'd seen a ghost. "You alright?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. The first night was perfect. We set up the tents, fished by the lake, and told stories by the campfire, laughing about the old days. But as the fire burned down to embers and the night deepened, something in the air shifted. It started when Ryan wandered off to pee. He didn't go far, but when he came back, he was pale, like he'd seen a ghost. "You alright?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. We all exchanged uneasy glances but brushed it off. Probably his imagination. But something about the way Ryan kept glancing over his shoulder made me feel uneasy too. As the night went on, the atmosphere grew tense. The woods, which had been so calm and peaceful before, now felt wrong. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves seemed to carry more weight, like we weren't alone. We all exchanged uneasy glances but brushed it off. Probably his imagination. But something about the way Ryan kept glancing over his shoulder made me feel uneasy too. As the night went on, the atmosphere grew tense. The woods, which had been so calm and peaceful before, now felt wrong. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves seemed to carry more weight, like we weren't alone. I sat up in the tent, my breath caught in my throat. The voice sounded close, too close, like it was right outside. "Look at me." I didn't move. I couldn't. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I was too scared to see what might be waiting outside. "Look at me." This time, the voice sounded like it was inside the tent. My skin crawled, and I turned on the flashlight in a panic, shining it around. The tent was empty, but the voice didn't stop. I scrambled out of the tent, breathing hard, desperate to wake the others. But when I stepped outside, the world around me was silent. The fire had gone out, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. The campsite was empty. I rushed to Ryan's tent, but it was open and empty too. Same with Ethan's and Jake's. Panic surged through me. Where the hell were they? Then, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the lake. It was tall, its features blurred in the darkness, but something about it felt wrong. I don't know how to explain it. It was like looking at a distorted reflection of a person, the way faces warp in a cracked mirror. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. "Look at me." The voice was clearer now, coming from the figure. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Against my will, I found myself stepping toward the figure, drawn in by that haunting whisper. As I got closer, the figure stepped into the moonlight. It was me. Or something that looked like me. Its face was my face, but twisted, wrong. The eyes were too wide, the mouth stretched into a crooked grin. It held up a hand, beckoning me closer. "Look at me." I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. The thing that wore my face stepped forward, mimicking my movements, as if it was taunting me. "Where are they?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The thing's smile widened, and it tilted its head in a way that made my stomach churn. "They're with me now." I turned and bolted back into the woods, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. The whispering voice followed me, echoing through the trees. "Look at me, look at me." I ran until I couldn't breathe, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I didn't stop until I reached a small clearing, far from the campsite. I collapsed onto the ground, panting, heart racing. But the voice was gone. When morning came, I found my way back to the campsite. Ethan, Ryan, and Jake were all there, packing up the gear as if nothing had happened. They looked at me like I was crazy when I told them what I'd seen. "You must have had a nightmare," Ethan said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Yeah, man, you were out cold all night," Jake added. "We didn't hear anything. But I knew it wasn't a dream. I still heard that voice, even in the daylight, whispering at the edge of my mind. Look at me." It started as the perfect camping trip. Just me and my best friend, Nate, heading deep into the backcountry for a weekend of fishing, hiking, and disconnecting from the world. We found a spot near a quiet lake, completely isolated. No other campers, no phone service, nothing but nature and the soft sound of the water lapping at the shore. By dusk, we had the fire going, the tent set up, and everything felt peaceful. That is, until the fog rolled in. It came out of nowhere, a thick blanket of mist that crept over the lake and slowly swallowed up the trees. 1 minute, everything was clear, and the next, the whole forest was drowned in an eerie, gray haze. I shrugged, trying to act like it didn't bother me, but something about the way the fog closed in made me uneasy. It was too thick, too sudden, like it had a life of its own. Soon, I couldn't even see the trees across the lake, just an endless sea of swirling white. We sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, the air growing colder. The fog muffled every sound, making everything feel distant, like we were completely cut off from the world. Then, we heard it. A voice, faint and muffled, carried through the fog. It was distant at first, but distinct. Someone was out there. Nate and I exchanged a look. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He nodded, frowning. "Yeah. What the hell?" We both stood up, staring into the wall of mist. The voice came again, a little clearer this time. A woman's voice, calling out. "Help, help me." My blood ran cold. There was no way anyone else was out here, we were miles from the nearest trail. No cars, no campers. Nothing. Maybe someone's lost? Nate suggested, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Yeah, maybe," I replied, but my gut told me something was off. "Help, please." The voice was louder now, closer. But I still couldn't see anything through the fog. It was like the sound was coming from all around us, from the fog itself. Nate grabbed his flashlight. "We should check it out." I didn't want to go, but I couldn't just leave someone out there if they were really in trouble. We grabbed our gear and headed toward the lake, where the voice seemed to be coming from. As we moved deeper into the fog, the voice grew clearer, more desperate. "Please, help me." We reached the edge of the lake, but there was no one there. just fog and the faint rippling of water. I shone my flashlight out over the lake, but it didn't penetrate more than a few feet into the mist. Everything beyond was an impenetrable white void. "Nate," I said, my voice shaking, "where is she?" Nate was standing by the water, shining his light around frantically. "I don't know, man. I swear she's right here." Then, the voice changed. It wasn't calling for help anymore. It was laughing. Low, guttural laughter, echoing through the fog, bouncing off the water. It was the kind of laugh that made my skin crawl, cold, unnatural, like something that didn't belong in this world. "What the hell is that?" Nate whispered, backing away from the shore. The laughter grew louder, and then, from the fog, a shape emerged. A shadow, tall and twisted, moving slowly toward us. It didn't walk, it glided, like it was part of the fog itself. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. "We need to go. Now." Nate didn't argue. We turned and bolted back toward the campsite, the fog closing in around us, thicker than before. I could hear the shadow behind us, the crunch of leaves and twigs as it moved closer, the low, eerie laughter echoing in my ears. We reached the campsite, breathless, and dove into the tent, zipping it up as fast as we could. Inside, we grabbed our knives, sitting in silence, listening. I froze, gripping the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. Nate's eyes were wide, his face pale. "Don't move," I whispered. "Maybe it'll go away." But it didn't go away. The shadow began circling the tent, its outline barely visible through the fabric. Every now and then, it would stop, and we'd hear something worse than the laughter, breathing. Slow, rasping breaths, like something old and rotting was just inches from us. We sat there, paralyzed, for what felt like hours. The shadow circled, the fog pressing in, suffocating. And then, the voice came again, but it wasn't distant anymore. It was right in my ear. "Come outside. I see you." I squeezed my eyes shut, my pulse racing. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I could feel the presence right outside the tent, could almost hear the scrape of its fingernails on the fabric. And then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The fog lifted with the dawn, leaving the campsite eerily silent. We didn't speak as we packed up, too shaken by what had happened. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, no footprints, no shadows, no laughter. But as we drove away, leaving the lake and the fog behind us, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, in the distance, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us go. I've never gone camping since. I'm not sure why we chose Black Hollow to camp. Maybe it was the name that drew us in, dark and mysterious, just the kind of place that dared you to come closer. My brother, Sam, had heard rumors about the place, something about an old settlement that had vanished long ago. The locals avoided it. Said it wasn't right. But Sam and I, along with our friends Dylan and Mike, weren't the types to get scared off by stories. We wanted to see the hollow for ourselves. It was secluded, miles from anywhere, and the thick trees blocked out the world like a wall. The perfect place to test our nerves. The drive was long, and by the time we arrived, it was nearly dusk. The air felt heavy. The woods were unnaturally still, as if everything had stopped just to watch us. There were no birds, no insects. Only silence. Creepy as hell, Dylan muttered, but he laughed it off. Hope there's room service. We set up camp near the center of the hollow, close to a large, ancient-looking tree. Its twisted branches reached out like skeletal arms, and its bark was blackened, like it had been scorched long ago. Something about it made me uncomfortable, but I ignored the feeling and helped Sam with the tent. Night fell quickly. The fire was our only light, flickering weakly in the oppressive darkness. Mike was poking at it with a stick, trying to get it to burn brighter, when we first heard it, the faintest sound, like someone whispering just beyond the trees. I froze, straining to hear. The others heard it too. Did you guys? I started, but Sam shook his head. It's just the wind, dude, he said, though I could tell he wasn't convinced. But it wasn't the wind. The whispers grew louder, like a soft chorus of voices, overlapping, murmuring just at the edge of comprehension. They seemed to come from everywhere, from the ground beneath us, from the trees, from the air itself. Mike stood up, glancing around nervously. Okay, that's not normal. No kidding, Dylan muttered, his eyes scanning the dark woods. I tried to focus on the fire, on anything but the strange whispers. But the more I listened, the clearer they became, like they were calling to us, beckoning us deeper into the hollow. Then, Sam stood up, his eyes wide, but distant, like he was in a trance. Sam? I called out, but he didn't respond. He just started walking toward the tree, that ancient, blackened tree. What the hell are you doing, man? Dylan shouted after him, but Sam didn't stop. He was staring straight ahead, his face blank, his eyes unblinking. We chased after him, but he moved faster, his steps eerily smooth, like he wasn't in control of his own body. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and now I could hear the words. Come to us, beneath, the earth. Sam reached the tree, his hand outstretched toward its gnarled bark. As he touched it, the ground beneath his feet began to shift. I swear to God, I saw the earth move. What the hell? Dylan yelled, backing away. The dirt at Sam's feet parted, and before we could do anything, he collapsed. He was sinking, being pulled into the ground. His body was half swallowed by the earth before we reached him, his arms flailing as if he'd finally woken up from whatever trance had gripped him. Help! Sam screamed, and we grabbed his arms, pulling with all our strength. But something unseen, was dragging him down. The whispers were louder now, a deafening chorus of voices coming from beneath the ground. Join us, join us. I nearly lost my grip, the soil around Sam's body pulling him deeper. His legs were completely gone, and his face was pale with terror. I could feel him slipping away. Pull harder. Mike shouted, his voice shaking, but no matter how hard we pulled, it was like the earth itself had become a living thing, determined to devour him. Then, without warning, Sam stopped screaming. His eyes went blank, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream, and his body went limp. The earth stopped pulling, leaving his upper half above the soil, his eyes wide and lifeless, staring at nothing. We dropped him in horror, stumbling back, gasping for breath. The whispers stopped. For a moment, everything was still, deathly silent. Then, from deep beneath the ground, we heard something, moving. Slowly, the dirt around Sam began to rise. His body twitched. No, 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 Dylan stammered, backing away, but I couldn't take my eyes off Sam's body. The ground convulsed, and something else started to rise. It wasn't Sam. It was something twisted, something grotesque. A figure, blackened and decayed, crawled out of the earth, its skin cracking, its eyes hollow. It was wearing my brother's face. I screamed, falling back, as the thing slowly turned its head to look at me, its mouth splitting into a grin far too wide for any human. "Join us," it whispered, in a voice that wasn't Sam's. We ran. We didn't stop to grab our gear or look back. We ran through the trees, through the fog, our lungs burning, the sound of the earth shifting behind us. The whispers followed us, chasing us, growing louder, until they were all I could hear. We made it back to the car just as dawn broke, the sunlight barely piercing through the thick canopy of trees. We sped away from Black Hollow, our hearts pounding, not saying a word. I don't know what we saw in that hollow, or what happened to Sam. All I know is that the thing that crawled out of the earth wasn't my brother anymore. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the whispers. They're waiting. I'll never forget that camping trip. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just me, my girlfriend Emily, and our two friends, Greg and Claire. We'd picked a spot deep in the forest, far away from any official campsites. We wanted solitude, a place where we wouldn't see another soul for days. Everything was perfect at first. The forest was serene, the air crisp. We spent the day hiking, swimming in the lake, and laughing around the campfire as the sun set. The sky turned a deep, dark blue, and the stars looked like they were hanging low, just for us. But then, night fell. It was after midnight, and the fire was dying down. Claire had already retreated to the tent, but the rest of us stayed up, chatting lazily as the embers flickered. That's when we heard it, a rustling noise, deep in the woods. Not like an animal. No, this was slower. Deliberate. We paused, listening. Probably a deer, Greg said, waving it off. But his voice lacked confidence. Then we heard it again, closer this time. A soft shuffle of feet on dry leaves. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead. The dense forest swallowed the beam, leaving everything beyond it a wall of black. "There's nothing there," I said, though my heart was pounding. Emily stood up, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Maybe we should go to bed." We all agreed. Something felt off, but no one wanted to say it out loud. As we crawled into our tents, I heard the noise again. Closer. Too close. I lay there in the dark, holding my breath, straining to hear more. There was only silence now, but that kind of silence that presses in, making you feel like something is hiding in it. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a faint sound, a slow, rhythmic tapping. It was so soft, like fingers gently tapping on wood. I blinked, trying to shake the fog of sleep from my mind. Emily was beside me, fast asleep. I listened harder, and the tapping grew more distinct. It wasn't coming from the trees or the ground. It was coming from above. With a sinking feeling, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. I had the flashlight in my hand, my heart hammering in my chest. When I clicked it on and aimed it upwards, the beam hit something in the tree above us. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. It was a figure. A person, no, something shaped like a person, clinging to the thick branches. Its body was pale, almost translucent, and far too thin. It had long limbs, like it had been stretched out. Its head was turned toward me, but its eyes, if they were eyes, were just black pits, hollow and staring straight into mine. I gasped, my hand shaking, but I couldn't move. It was frozen, watching me. Slowly, it lifted one long, bony finger and tapped it against the tree branch again, that same slow, rhythmic sound I'd heard before. Tap. 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 Suddenly, it scurried up the tree with unnatural speed, disappearing into the canopy. I slammed the tent zipper shut and crawled back inside, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't wake Emily. I didn't even tell the others when morning came. I told myself I'd imagined it, that it was a trick of the light, that I was half asleep and had dreamed it. But the next night, it happened again. We'd all gone to bed early this time, shaken by a sense of unease that none of us could explain. The woods had grown too quiet, the air too thick. Around 2 a.m. the tapping returned. This time, I didn't wait. I shook Emily awake, my voice a panicked whisper. "Get up. Something's out there." She groggily followed me, but when we unzipped the tent, nothing was outside. The woods were dark, still. But I knew it was there, watching us from somewhere in the shadows. We woke Greg and Claire, and they could tell from my face that something was seriously wrong. I finally told them about the thing in the tree, about what I'd seen the night before. Greg didn't believe me, not at first, but Emily backed me up, saying she'd heard the tapping too. We decided to pack up right then and there, not willing to spend another night in those cursed woods. As we hurriedly stuffed our gear into our backpacks, the tapping started again. Closer. Louder. It wasn't coming from a single tree this time. It was all around us, tapping from every direction, echoing off the trees. My flashlight flickered, and when I turned it on, I saw them. Dozens of them. Figures, just like the one I'd seen, clinging to the trees, hanging from branches, staring down at us with hollow, black eyes. Some were only a few feet away, watching us from above, their limbs impossibly long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. I screamed, dropping the flashlight, and we all bolted. I didn't care what direction we were running in, as long as it was away from those things. The tapping followed us, that relentless, hollow sound chasing us through the forest. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually, we broke through the tree line, stumbling onto the old dirt road where we'd parked. We jumped into the car, not saying a word, and sped away, leaving our tents and most of our gear behind. We never went back. I don't know what those things were, but they still haunt me. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that sound in my dreams. Tap. 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 And I know they're still out there. We weren't supposed to camp in the ashwood forest. The locals warned us that people who went in sometimes didn't come out, or when they did, they weren't the same. But me, Luke, and Jess weren't the type to believe in legends. We thought the stories were just there to scare away curious hikers. So, when we found the trailhead at the edge of Ashwood, the sun already sinking behind the trees, we didn't hesitate. "This place looks awesome," Jess said, taking pictures as we walked. "So creepy." Luke grinned, but there was something off about his smile. I could tell even he was a little uneasy. The trees were tall, ancient, and twisted in unnatural ways. The further we hiked, the darker it got, like the forest was swallowing the light. It wasn't long before our phones lost signal. That should have been the first red flag, but we kept walking, pushing deeper into the heart of Ashwood. The plan was simple: set up camp, spend the night, and hike out in the morning. But the further we went, the more wrong everything felt. The air was heavy, like it was pressing down on us, making it harder to breathe. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves, started to fade until there was nothing but silence. Not a peaceful silence, but something unnatural, like the whole world was holding its breath. "We should stop here," Luke said, his voice strained. "Set up camp." I agreed, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. There was a clearing up ahead, a perfect spot to pitch our tents. The moment we stopped, though, I noticed something strange. The trees around the clearing, they weren't right. Their bark looked burnt, and their branches twisted up toward the sky like they were reaching for something. We set up camp in silence, the air growing colder as the sun vanished completely behind the canopy. Jess built a fire, but the flames felt dim, barely lighting the clearing. "I don't like this place," she muttered, staring into the fire. "It feels like we're not alone." I laughed it off, but deep down, I felt it too. The sensation that we were being watched, that something was out there, lurking in the dark. But when I looked into the trees, all I saw was blackness. That's when the first strange thing happened. "I'll grab some more firewood," Luke said, standing up. He grabbed his flashlight and wandered off into the trees. We didn't think anything of it at first. He was gone maybe 5 minutes, 10 at most. But when he came back, his face was pale, his eyes wide and panicked. "What the hell, man? Where have you been?" Jess asked, annoyed. Luke looked confused, glancing between us. "What do you mean?" "I was gone for, like, an hour." I stared at him, my stomach dropping. "You've only been gone for a few minutes, Luke. We just started talking." His face drained of color, and he sat down, trembling. I swear, it felt like I was out there for hours. The trees, they kept moving. No matter where I walked, the path kept changing. I tried to shrug it off, but Jess's eyes met mine, and I could see the fear in them. We decided to stay close to the fire for the rest of the night. No one wanted to wander off after that. We sat in a tense silence, listening to the crackling of the fire, but even that felt muted, like the forest was swallowing up the sound. Then, just after midnight, Jess froze. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We listened. At first, I didn't hear anything. But then, there it was. A soft, shuffling sound. Like something dragging across the ground. It was coming from the trees. "Probably an animal," I whispered, though I didn't believe it. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't just one noise now, it was many. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, and deliberate. Luke grabbed the flashlight and shined it into the trees. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but endless rows of twisted trunks and black branches. But the footsteps continued. Suddenly, Jess let out a terrified gasp, pointing toward the edge of the clearing. I followed her gaze, and my heart stopped. There, at the edge of the firelight, was a figure. Tall and thin, its body unnaturally stretched, like it had been warped by the forest itself. Its face, if you could call it a face, was just a pale, smooth surface, no eyes, no mouth, just blank skin reflecting the light. And it wasn't alone. All around the clearing, just out of reach of the fire, more figures stood. Dozens of them. Their bodies twisted and broken, like they'd been shaped by the trees. "They're watching us," Jess whimpered, backing closer to the fire. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my eyes fixed on the figures, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They didn't move, didn't breathe. Just stood there, surrounding us, waiting. Then, without warning, the fire flickered, like a gust of wind had blown through the clearing. But there was no wind. The fire dimmed further, the shadows closing in, and one of the figures stepped forward. Its body jerked unnaturally with every movement, like it didn't know how to walk properly. It stopped just at the edge of the firelight, its blank face staring right at me. Then, it spoke. Not with a mouth. Not with a voice. The words just appeared in my mind, sharp and cold, like they were being forced into my head. "You're in our place now." I gasped, stumbling back, my legs giving out beneath me. Jess screamed, grabbing my arm, and Luke was shouting something, but it was drowned out by a deafening hum that filled the air, vibrating the ground beneath us. The figures moved closer, slowly stepping into the light. I could see them clearly now, their skin was bark, twisted and blackened, their bodies fused with the trees themselves. And their eyes. God, their eyes, they were just empty, endless pits, dark holes that stared into something far beyond us. "Time doesn't work here," the voice whispered in my head again. "You belong to the forest now." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world tilted, the fire flickering wildly, the ground beneath me feeling soft, like I was sinking. The figures surrounded us, their twisted bodies closing in. And then, everything went black. I woke up in the morning, lying in the middle of the clearing. The fire was out. The air was cold. Jess and Luke were beside me, still unconscious. When I shook them awake, we didn't say anything. We didn't need to. Because there were no tents. No sign of our camp. We'd been gone for 3 days.